3 years ago, UN member states agreed to kickstart the creation of the world's first legally binding international treaty on plastic pollution. Over the following years, the world's nations have come together in 5 major meetings with the goal of drawing up the landmark treaty. It has, perhaps unsurprisingly, been a difficult process, and progress has been hampered by disagreements and opposition from a so-called petrochemical bloc, made up of petrostates and industry. Delegates are meeting in Geneva this week and next to mount a final push towards concluding the treaty. So, in this video, we're going to explain why this is so important and the major challenges that lie ahead. Have you ever wondered how much money TLDR makes each year? Or who's funding our journalism? Well, we think transparency is super important. So we answer both questions in our recent video. It's linked in the description. It's worth starting by explaining the scale of the plastics crisis, as even though we're surrounded by plastic in our daily lives, it's important to understand it on a global scale. From the turn of the century to 2019, global plastic production has doubled to reach 460 million tonnes produced per year. And on current plans, global plastic production is expected to double or perhaps even triple by 2050. This is a problem. According to the OECD, of the more than 350 million tonnes of plastic waste produced globally in 2019, just 9% was recycled. Nearly half went into landfill, nearly 20% was incinerated, and an astonishing 22% was lost outside the waste management system, ending up leaking into and polluting both terrestrial and aquatic environments, particularly in poorer countries. Visible, tangible plastic waste is only one part of the problem. The production of plastics, which are almost exclusively derived from fossil fuels, was responsible for 5.3% of global greenhouse gas emissions in 2019, driving oil demand and exacerbating global warming. That's not even to mention the health concerns. We know that microplastics are basically everywhere, from Antarctic sea ice to drinking water to human blood, and thousands of chemicals of concern, hazards to health and the environment, have been identified in plastics. So the case for a global plastics treaty is clear, and that's why in 2022 the United Nations Environment Assembly passed Resolution 514, which kick-started the process of creating a treaty. More specifically, an internationally legally binding treaty on plastic pollution, including in the marine environment. Now, the last time we made a video on the plastic treaty was back in December, in the aftermath of the 5th negotiation session, known as INC 5.1 in Busan, South Korea. This was meant to be the final session, but countries were unable to reach and agree on a final treaty, instead ending up with a 22-page document drawn up by the chair riddled with 371 brackets, which are used to indicate that text has not yet been agreed by the negotiating parties. In a sign of the scale of the crisis and the desire of the international community to reach an agreement, it was decided that another final round of negotiations, dubbed INC 5.2, would be held in Geneva, which kicks off this week. And given constraints on the UN's budget, this may really be the final opportunity to conclude a treaty. Arguably, the most contentious issue in the treaty relates to the production of plastics. In other words, should the treaty aim to cap and cut the amount of plastic actually produced, or instead focus on waste management like recycling? More countries favour the former, with some 100 of them supporting a draft text at the INC 5.1 that included legally binding global reductions in plastic production, and phasing out certain chemicals and single-use plastic products. This position was reaffirmed by nearly 100 countries at the UN Ocean Conference in France in June, including many European, African and small island states, who signed up to the Nice wake-up call for an ambitious plastics treaty that called for the adoption of a global target to reduce the production of plastics. However, a smaller group of various petrostates, including Saudi Arabia, Russia and Iran, a bloc known as the like-minded countries, are staunchly opposed to production cuts and banning certain chemicals found in plastics. This is hardly surprising. As the world shifts away from using fossil fuels for transport and energy, petrochemicals like plastics are a lifeboat for big oil producers. In fact, petrochemicals are expected to become the main driver of oil demand growth at some point this decade. But the argument that the plastics crisis can be tackled sufficiently with waste management and without addressing production just doesn't hold up. This obviously isn't to say that recycling is a bad thing. But remember, we're looking at perhaps a tripling of global plastic production over the next 2.5 decades. And scientists have made clear that the harm of plastic pollution, think greenhouse gas emissions, human health, and plastic waste, simply cannot be prevented by improvements in waste management alone. Nevertheless, a monumental effort has been launched by the so-called petrochemical bloc, which includes petrostates and the fossil fuel and petrochemical industries, to exert their influence during the negotiations to narrow the treaty's scope and exclude production cuts and banning certain chemicals. We saw up close, for example, the use of delaying tactics of certain member states like Saudi Arabia and Russia, with extended discussions on procedural matters, prolonging sessions, and holding up progress. According to the Centre for International Environmental Law, or CEIL, the presence and influence of fossil fuels and chemical industry lobbyists has grown with each round of negotiations. And at the last session, INC 5.1, the 220 industry lobbyists outnumbered the delegations from the European Union and all its member states combined. Lobbyists come from individual companies like Dow and ExxonMobil, but also from wider trade associations, and CEIL analysis even identified 17 industry lobbyists within national delegations, including, but not limited to, those from China, Iran and Kazakhstan. With crunch time approaching in Geneva, industry lobbyists are sure to have another strong presence. Now, if we place the issue of the treaty's content to one side, there's a more meta procedural issue that's massively hindered progress in the negotiations towards a treaty, and that's the decision-making process, which is still contentious going into Geneva. So far, the method has been one of consensus, which basically means a decision can only be made if no negotiating party objects. This is why the draft text, as it stands, is filled with bracketed segments, i.e. things that haven't actually been agreed. The draft rules of procedure for the INC process allows for qualified majority voting when consensus fails. However, like-minded countries insist that this draft rule was never officially adopted, so consensus has continued to reign supreme. What the state parties do about this will therefore be crucial to the overall outcome of the Geneva session. Will they continue to strive for consensus and accept a watered-down treaty? Will the more ambitious majority push to apply the draft rules and secure an agreement committing to production cuts and chemicals of concern by majority vote, overcoming the objections of the like-minded countries? Or, if no agreement is forthcoming, might the ambitious countries opt to strike an agreement of the willing outside the UN system? One thing is clear, it'll take courage from ambitious nations to defend a treaty that can truly tackle the plastic crisis. These talks could mark a turning point, not just for environmental and climate action, but for the future of multilateralism.